Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through the state of affairs for the province of Ontario. Here's a little brief bio about myself. I'm a professional accountant by trade. I have over 28 years' experience in both public sector policies, teaching, as well as private sector. My agenda will be talking about GDP. I'll focus on a couple sectors like manufacturing, housing, and mining, as well as the government finances. You can't start any conversation about Ontario unless you get look at the financial position of Ontario. During the 2018 election, the Liberals lied with the value of the deficit. The deficit, in terms of what they said was as part of the budget cycle, was about $6.7 billion. The Auditor General did a pre-election audit, and it turned out that the actual deficit that she saw as part of her work was $11.7 billion. So the Liberals themselves never really were accurate in terms of the deficit. So part of the goal of transforming government when Doug Ford got elected as the premier was to look at the fiscal management cycle and get the true indication of what the deficit. That work just came to conclusion, and it's now shown that the real deficit is $15 billion. Now, key things to remember with Ontario. Ontario's economy is very sluggish. Anything you see less than like 2.2% growth is really sluggish growth. The second thing is, and it's been known for a decade or more, that Ontario has not a revenue problem but a spending problem. And that's something the Liberals have never admitted during their whole time in office. Second point is Moody, who grades the Ontario bonds, and if there's any sort of downgrade that impacts the premium on those bonds, the higher a premium, the higher the interest rate. So basically, they've had Ontario on watch and downgraded the bonds as well. So overall, the fiscal cycle for Ontario is not very good. Like I mentioned before with GDP growth, it's very sluggish. And you would expect where the U.S. is in terms of its economic cycle that we would see far more growth. But because the Liberals knocked out a lot of the manufacturing capacity, never really promoted getting goods out of the ground to market, we're seeing where we're just having sluggish growth now. And you add in also as well as their policies in terms of minimum wage, cap and trade, and the list goes on and on. It did nothing but put more pressure on business to reduce costs and become less competitive. Manufacturing is a key part of the Ontario economy, but it's under a great deal of stress. The Liberals, through various terms of policy, as I mentioned before, whether it's been the labor reforms, whether it's been hikes to hydro rates, whether it's the cap and trade, whether it's more regulations, have kind of put every time manufacturing or any sort of business Ontario is looking to expand, the Liberals have put hurdles up. And that's something that needs to change under the new government. You can't talk about Ontario unless you talk about housing. And there's systemic issues with housing. It's not an issue just the provincial government, municipal or federal, or the private sector can fix. It's a combination all sectors need to get together to reform how we approach building housing and make housing more affordable across Ontario, but not just Ontario, across Canada. Ontario is very rich in natural resources in the north, but under the Liberals, led by either McGuinty or Kathleen Wynne, anything north of Toronto basically was never their focus. So we've had projects like lithium, forestry, chromite that have been very little activities happen in those areas because the Liberals' lack of emphasis on getting those goods out of the ground to market. The other thing they never really emphasized to help exports is you've got a few port cities that could be expanded, like Thunder Bay, Sault Ste. Marie, even Hamilton could be expanded to help better support exports. That was not a focus of the Liberals as well. You can't talk about Ontario unless you talk about what's shifted in between revenue. Ontario had, at beginning of 2014, during that year, a baseline revenue of $68.4 billion. The Liberals have basically doubled that over their 15 years in office. And even if you use a cost of inflation and all that, They've grown or added new taxes that didn't exist before. They brought in a Ontario Health Premium. They brought in a cap and trade. They brought in harmonization. So there's the list goes on and on in terms of what they did in terms of taxation, but they did very little in terms of reforming how government operates. And that's the next slide that's going to lead into it. So the major spending in Ontario is both education and healthcare. Now, those account for close to 60% of the budget. And what they never did in there, they never reformed it. Like there's more teachers making over 100,000 a year than ever have been. They didn't reform arbitration. We still are seeing wages for government 12 to 14% higher than the private sector. They also expanded jobs in the public sector at a faster pace than the private sector. Those are all recipe for disaster, and that's what Wynne has left then the Conservative government under Doug Ford. So what is next for Ontario? Briefly, it's got a lot of work to do to reform itself, from the size of government and how it operates to bringing in policies that's going to encourage foreign direct investment to bring jobs back in the manufacturing and the goods producing sector. Government itself has to refocus on delivering goods and services and not the size of government. So there's going to be a need to look at attrition rates, compensation, look at how we manage the government assets of what could be possibly sold off, and a real emphasis on value for money. Thank you.